So I wrote a blog post about this, and I kind of just converted my blog post into slides. If you guys have never heard of DECSET app, it basically allows you to write, and actually I'm going to show you. You write Markdown, and your Markdown gets converted into slides using really beautiful pre-built templates. So footer, add Stauffer format, front end awesome, meetup goes down to the bottom there. Organizing CSS, basically each slide is divided by 3 dashes, and then you're using Markdown to basically write the rest of the app. And you can see organizing CSS down there. If I wanted to call it like CSS exclamation point, I hit save, and now my slides change.
And what is that called?
It's called DECSET. It's $20 in the Mac App Store. And so I normally am like the type to like be in Keynote, being all like organizational. I had 40 minutes over lunch yesterday. I took my blog post, which was in Markdown, basically put a whole bunch of dividers and put it in DECSET. So that's literally what we have right now. So I'm hoping it's going to turn into an actually really great presentation. We'll see. But I had to at least geek out and show you guys that. So what we're talking about is methods of organizing CSS. When we think about computer science, architecture, design patterns, all these things that you may or may not have heard of before, but there are ways where we, rather than just kind of like throwing a whole bunch of crap into a text editor and hacking it until it does what we kind of wanted and hoping it doesn't break, we start to recognize that, hey, over time, over many developers, we realize that we should do these same things these same ways rather than reinventing the wheel every single time. So over the amount of time we've been doing computer programming, we've developed patterns. We say, oh, wow, we do this same thing over and over and over again. Why don't we recognize it, call it a pattern, or create a library or whatever, use jQuery, it's the same kind of thing. We had to detect IE8 versus IE6 versus IE7 versus Firefox or whatever 10,000 times, create a library that does it for you, so now you don't have to do that same repetitive thing over and over again. So the problem is CSS is, and in general front end, but we can see that JavaScript has started getting a lot of love in this area. CSS hasn't so much. CSS, there's no such thing as a CSS framework. People say they are. It's not a framework, it's just a whole bunch of pre-packaged code that you can use if you want, but it's not a framework. We have CSS preprocessors, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in general, no matter what it is, even if you have tools that make it easier to do a good job through CSS, you're still just throwing a whole bunch of crap into a file somewhere and kind of hoping you're doing a good job. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to do a good job in organizing our CSS well, and learning from design patterns and all this kind of knowledge we have from other places, back-end code, all that kind of stuff, and applying it to our CSS. And especially people who have like computer science degrees, which is not me, I was an English major. But when you see them interact with the front end, especially with CSS, they want to shoot their brains out because they're like, this is so horrible, it doesn't do what I want. If I was writing this in Erlang, it would be perfectly predictable. And so it's like, okay, well, let's learn a little bit from the benefits they're getting from Haskell and Erlang and machine compiler code and apply it to our CSS world. So we're going to use 3 different topics. They're OOCSS, SMACSS, and BEM. Not everybody pronounces them. Some people say BEM. They're probably cooler than me. I'm going to say BEM. We already did this, but for the sake of the recording, I'm Matt Stauffer. I'm partner and technical director at Titan Co. I write, I blog, I teach, occasionally I write code, and I'm Matt Stauffer on Twitter. So we already did that part. So CSS is messy. Problem 1 we've discovered with DECSET. It's not letting me see the preview of my upcoming slides like Keynote does. Okay, this is my first time ever using it. So some of the things we will learn from back-end code. So there's a lot of different ways of organizing back-end code. There's a lot of different types of design patterns, but one of the ones that I work in a lot is object-oriented programming. And a lot of the functional concepts around why OOP is what it is because you're thinking about things in terms of being objects. This object, that object, that object. They all talk to each other. And so a few of the pieces that we're focusing on here are, for starters, decoupling. So this is spaghetti code. This is bad. This is difficult to work with. We'll talk about why in a second. This is object-oriented code. It's a whole bunch of different circles that are all talking to each other, right? So decoupling means taking this and going like this. It's making it so that one piece is less intricately and painfully tied to all the other pieces. You're decoupling them. So now you have pieces that are a little bit more separate. And as a part of decoupling, we start thinking about, well, how do I know which of the spaghetti strands go here versus here? Starts thinking about what defines an object. So one of them is called the single responsibility principle, which kind of says each one should have a single responsibility. So as you start separating out your little pieces of code that do your object, 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 as you describe one of them, you should be able to say, it does this. And the moment you start putting commas or and or in your description of what that thing does, it's probably starting to break the single responsibility principle. So if you say, well, I extracted an object from my spaghetti, I feel really good. What does it do? Well, it does this and this and this, except when this, and then it also has to pull in this, and sometimes it generates that. It's probably breaking single responsibility principle. And also separation of concerns, same kind of thing. Concerns, what is it concerned with? Well, if it's concerned with 25 different things, it's probably too big, and you can pull out a whole bunch of little objects with it. And then finally, encapsulation, which means not only are you separating them, but theoretically, each of these little chunks we just pulled out, we should be able to take it and use it in that project, and that project, and that project, and that project, and that project. It should be encapsulated. So it's not, even if you separate it, well, if it's got a whole bunch of strings running to that other one, like way too many of them, you can't pull it without pulling that, which relies on that, which relies on that. And so at that point, it's just spaghetti, you just stretched it out a little bit. So as you can see, and there's a lot, I could talk about OOP all day, what we're trying to do is find an object that is nice and neat. It has very few ties to the things around it. It only does one thing. It does that one thing well. It's very easy to understand and describe what the one thing is. Okay? So we're talking about that usually in back-end programming. So now we're going to be applying that to front-end programming. So object-oriented CSS, the general concept is let's take all those ideas and let's apply it to our CSS. So Nicole Sullivan is an author. I think she worked at maybe Yahoo at the time, and she basically started describing this concept. And she said identify the patterns and the objects or modules in your code. So as we think about object-oriented programming, we've got the objects in our back-end code. So there's a mailer, and there's a biller, and there's a, whatever. And she's saying, okay, let's do the same thing in our front-end code. So one of the things she did, and I thought I didn't. I thought I'd gotten this graphic. But she basically took this, well, you know what happened? Let's learn what DexSet does when I click a link. Whoa, there we go. Okay. Hey, yo. All right, so this right here. So what she did was she looked at this right here. She saw what was going on, and she said, interesting, this looks like it's all these really complicated pieces of code, but what I'm really identifying is that there's a single pattern over and over and over again. It's 2 columns, and on the left side, I've got probably an image, but some kind of block. On the right side, I've got a big chunk of content. And as you can see, as it gets redder and redder and redder, because there's a certain amount, there's actually a whole bunch of those nested within each other. So each of these kind of status updates, that was one of them. But then each of the comments from the status update, that was another one. And then over here, you got the same kind of thing. Icon on the left, text on the right. The ads, icon on the left, text on the right. The notifications here, icon on the left, text on the right. She's like, wow, that's a repeating pattern. That's a module. Let's extract that. So she called it the media object. And she said, well, how do we describe this thing, icon on the left, text on the right, in a way where we can actually call it a module and we can reuse it in many places around our site? So she identified that if she named it media, then what she would need is basically the image, so this kind of left side, and then the body, the kind of right side, and then the wrapper. So now you have a module. It's the media module, and the media module has 2 children, the image and the body, and that's it. And you can use that everywhere, anytime you need that kind of split. And she's like, oh, well, what if I need it to be backwards? Cool, so she added a modifying class that you could add that says, put them this way, right? Because they don't necessarily have to be left and right. But still, you have that same kind of presentationally relationship. And so that's a module that you can now apply. And again, that was kind of what she was doing here. She's showing off is like how very flexible this kind of idea is, right? So that's the basics of OOCSS, and that's kind of where she was coming from, is identifying those repeating patterns and extract them out so that rather than redefining that same relationship, left rail, right rail, whatever, 25 different times, you identify it once and then you apply it in all those different contexts. So around the same time, this other guy, Snook, was coming up with this idea called Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS. He called it SMACSS. And since we're just doing this, why don't we just look up his website so you can see it. It's a book. You can read it for free online, and then if you appreciate it, you can go buy it so that you can support him. And this was similar time. He didn't specifically call this OOCSS, but in the end, it was basically the same thing. And this was a system for him for learning how to organize his code. And he wasn't saying, I want to learn how OOP organizes their code, but there's a lot of parallels, so we should look at it. So what he looked at is, really, I look at all my CSS code and identify it as being 5 primary groupings. So when Nicole Sullivan didn't say anything about grouping your code. She just said put it into modules, and that was it. So this guy, he said, first of all, CSS code can be your base code. HTML, H1, H2, A, UL, LI. Those aren't modules. You're just styling your basic HTML elements. Okay, great. That goes in your base. And let's just imagine we've got 5 CSS files. Base.css, layout.css, module.css, state.css, theme.css. Layout are the big page sections. The big, you step back from 10 feet from your website. What are your big sections? Header, sidebar, body, footer, right rail, left rail, primary rail, whatever. Module is what we were just talking about. So almost everything that she was identifying, Nicole Solomon was identifying, all this OOP stuff, they're modules. And theoretically, you could put this module, this media module, in the header, in the footer, in the left rail, in the right rail, in the body, encapsulated with another one in the body, all kind of stuff. They're just, all they are is just they know, hey, this is what I'm supposed to perform. My existence means left side has an image, right side has a body, and you do whatever you want, put me wherever you want, add styles on top of me, whatever you want. States are the way that you take an existing module, and almost always with JavaScript, pretty much always, unless you're doing some CSS trickery like Chris Coyier kind of stuff, basically almost always using JavaScript, you turn on or off a particular flag on that module to say its state is different. So for example, if you've got an accordion, the accordion may be opened or it may be closed. So the accordion is an accordion, but some of the way it displays depends on that state. So state can be applied to a layout, it can be applied to a module. State is just some way of toggling that this is momentarily different than it might be at a different moment. And then finally theme, which almost nobody ever uses, which is if you actually, he definitely worked at Yahoo at the time, which is making me think that Nicole Solomon might not have, which is if you have like my red theme and my blue theme and my Valentine's Day theme and all kind of stuff. And he explicitly says this is the optional one. You only use this one if you're in that context. So suddenly we now know how to organize our CSS. We have these big chunks that we're putting into, and this module is kind of this really important object-oriented concept. Finally, how do you name it? Now, the SMACSS guy came up with some naming concepts. His usually were a single letter, dash, whatever. And so it was like the layout ones were going to be .l dash header, .l dash footer, .m dash whatever for modules or whatever. And it didn't really pick up all that well, and people were kind of confused because how do you figure out well, okay, we'll talk about this later. How do you figure out children? How do you name the children? And what if there's a body child, but then something else has a body child? Are there things going to end up conflicting, and then you're nesting, and there's some concerns with nesting? So Yandex, which is a Russian search engine giant, which I thought was spam because all of a sudden I was getting totally overloaded with things from Yandex on one of my websites, and I was sure they were just horrible, and then I see them associated with BEM, and I'm like, what's going on? So they may be a little bit hyper-aggressive, but they've done some really good thinking about how to optimize their websites. So they came up with this BEM, which is block element modifier. It's a way to think about naming your classes that basically recognizes that you've got a block, which is kind of your module name, so media before. You've got an element, which is one of its children, and then you optionally have a modifier on the block or the element. This is actually not exactly the BEM that they came up with. Harry Roberts, who goes by CSS Wizardry online, modified it a little bit, and we've been using Harry Roberts' version for years, and it's a really good fit. So basically what you're looking at is, and I don't know if I gave any examples. No, I didn't. So if you've got a block and it's named media, and then every media has a image, remember, and then a body. So that would be dot media underscore underscore image, and then dot media underscore underscore body. So basically what you're doing is you're flattening all your selectors. You're not saying dot media space dot body, you're saying dot media underscore underscore body, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But let's just understand that's the naming syntax. So if, for example, you were to have a reversed one, right? So instead of it being left-right for image body, it's going to be right-left. Then it would be, the parent div would be dot media hyphen hyphen reversed, or alt, or whatever you wanted to name it. And then you would do all your styles that said, well, if I've got a dot media underscore underscore body within this, then do these layouts, otherwise do that. So every single one of these things we're doing is a single class. Dot media underscore underscore image, dot media hyphen hyphen body, dot media hyphen hyphen reversed, whatever. They're all a single class, and that's really going to be valuable for us in a way we'll talk about in a second.
Question?
Yeah.
Would you ever have a nested
no, grandchildren are
assignment element?
Oh yeah, you can put children.
Two sets of double underscores?
No, grandchildren are a bad idea. We would try it originally, even though the BEM guy said don't do it, and you end up getting into the mind cussiest stuff you'll ever run into, and you run into a lot of weird performance issues. So just kind of like blanket no, And
It's time to start a new block.
yep.
Basically.
And sometimes that's difficult because you're like, well, it shouldn't necessarily be another block. It couldn't be extracted. So like every once in a while we cheat and do that anyway. And we actually usually, so remember there's the 5 organizational systems of SMACSS. We usually actually replace theme with a different 5, a 5th one, which is called shame, which is, this is where I put all the CSS that I know I shouldn't have done, but I did for X reason. And we use git, which means there's a feature called git blame, which shows you who wrote every single line of code. So at any point you can go to shame and be like, wow, there's like 500 lines in our shame.css file, and then you do git blame and you can figure out who's putting all this stuff in there. When you put something in shame.css, you're saying, usually, I know this isn't the right way to do it, and because of some particular constraint, whether it's time or a temporary need or whatever, I'm putting this here, but if we have rainy day time, we need to go back and fix this. So grandchildren, if you need to do grandchildren, put them in shame and recognize later that you probably don't want to do it. We do it occasionally, but there's a lot of really wise, amazing ideas for why you shouldn't. I've consumed all of them, forgotten half of them, and come to the conclusion that it's a bad idea. So hopefully that helps. So, and I'll give you guys more examples. I didn't write out all my examples because, again, it took me 40 minutes, but we can do some actual coding once I'm done with the slideshow aspect of it. So one really cool thing is you end up writing .media underscore, you can hear me saying underscore underscore hyphen hyphen. It takes a while to write these things out. Thankfully, Sass and Less both make it much easier for you to do these things. So if we want this,
Can you collapse the window or something?
I can't. So I'll probably just show it to you guys in a second.
Okay.
It's very easy, but it means I have almost no configuration ability. So I'll just show you guys this one in my Markdown code, because this is magical. Okay, so if we're generating this right here, yes, okay, cool. Dot object, and then we've got dot object descendant, right? So imagine you've got a whole bunch of rules, you're writing this thing over and over again, you've got a lot of repetition, which gets really frustrating, because if you want to rename object later, or just because you hate repetition, this is going to drive you nuts. So Sass and Less have things where you can do descendants. And normally in Sass, the way you're using a descendant is you got object, and then you've got, dot descendant. This is so hard to spell that word. And you're like, wow, this is really cool. Nesting is the greatest. But the problem is that ends up leaving you with this. And again, I know I haven't described to you why, I will in a second, but that's actually really bad. So thankfully, recent versions of Sass and Less allow you to do this. If you do ampersand underscore underscore, or ampersand anything, it's basically this right here represents the parent. So for example, this is going to give me dot object or underscore underscore descendant, like that. But I also could do this ampersand for something else. If I wanted to say, if this is the reversed object like we're talking about, it would be object hyphen hyphen, or ampersand hyphen hyphen reversed. Or if I just wanted to say object anytime you added another class, this has nothing to do with BEM, this is just Sass, you could do ampersand dot, red version or something like that, and then you'd actually type it correctly, and then you'd get what you wanted. So ampersand within Sass and Less just represents the parent, but modified in X way. So this is the parent, but it's not actually the parent because you're modifying it by extending the class name. So now it's actually a new class that just happens to be the same class name as the parent with some letters after it. And so that allows us to very easily nest our children in here in a way that gives all this benefit of nesting in Sass and Less, but it ends up generating a flat descendant structure tree. And I keep saying I'm going to talk to you guys about it, but you probably think I'm crazy if you don't know why. So I'll pause and I'll talk about why is it valuable to have flat selectors. So with CSS, the most complicated thing you're going to run into, and almost all the time when you have problems, whether or not you recognize this is why you're having problems, is because of the hierarchy. It's the specification, the specificity of which rules get parsed more important than other rules. So the most simple aspect of parsing, parsing order with CSS is whichever one comes first, which versus last. So if I define A, and then later I define A, the later definition is going to win out because it overrides the first one. That's just the simplest one. But also, the more specific the definition is, which is kind of difficult to know all the rules around it, the more likely it is to get applied. So for example, if I say A is blue, and then I say, but A with the class of awesome is red, well, the A with the class of awesome is going to override the A if the A has class of awesome. So the more specific, the more targeted your definition is, the more precedence it gets, the more important it is. And that means when you end up with things like this, so let's say you did what I did on a website a couple of years ago, which I still am paying for, and you say, well, you know how often you do all these styles for the H1 and the H2 and the A and the this like that, but you then have to totally undo all those styles anytime you use those in the header or in the footer, in the side nav. And you really want to be targeting the body, right? And somebody wrote this very eloquent article about why you should do what I'm about to tell you, which is a terrible idea, but I didn't know it then. Why don't you only target the H1, the H2, the A's, all that kind of stuff in the body with these very natural, things, so that all the ones on the outside, which are going to do wacky, weird stuff too anyway, you're going to, take your list and you're going to turn it sideways so it looks like a navigation bar or whatever. All this crazy stuff we do, you don't have to undo it. And if you've never had this experience, then this won't make as much sense. But in the end, I ended up basically doing everything like this, H1. This is just for basic styles, H2. This is for my text, for a blog post or whatever, this is how I want it. And I thought this was really great because now when I do navbar, H2, I won't have to undo all of this because this might be like, whatever. This might be Helvetica size 24. Well, a navbar H2 might actually be this little tiny thing. I don't want to undo that. So let's set it to base. Let's do a reset everywhere. And then here I set what readable standards should look like. And then here I can just do whatever I want. Really great idea. The problem is this now becomes .body H2. Okay? So let's say the color of this is red. And let's say I want to be able to apply a class just to some of the H2s that just make them a different color. Okay, so let's just say there's an alternate H2 page title kind of thing. Let's do actually H1 so it'll make a little more sense. Page title is red. On some page title needs to be green, right? Cool. So I just say, whatever, dot alternate, and then I'm like, cool, color green. And then I do, on that page, I do, div class equals body, and then H1 class equals alternate. Awesome. So what color would that be? It'd be green, right? But it's not green. Because this is a single selector. This is double. This is more specific. This will be red. But you're like, okay, that's fine. I'll just do this, right? But then later you found you had done this somewhere. Well, that right there adds your specificity. Or what if you just did this really simple thing, right? Page title. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, I just want to apply alternate to it. Well, it turns out that if you use the ID, pretty much just blows everything else out of the water. You literally cannot overwhelm ID, except in an old version of Internet Explorer, if you had, I think it was over 600 classes. Somebody tested this. If you did over 600 classes, it would overwhelm an ID. No idea why, total bug. So basically, and this is an additional note that I didn't plan to say, never, ever, 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 ever use IDs for styling. Ever, ever, ever. You probably are doing it. Stop doing it. It will bite you. It is terrible. Don't do it. Yeah, just don't do it. IDs are okay for JavaScript hooks, but they're not okay for CSS styling. Go get rid of them all your CSS styles and you'll thank me in a year. So, and there's all sorts of specificity, whether you're using descendant selectors, how many descendant selectors, how many classes, so there's this, what about this? What about this versus this? And then you're like, oh, well, I want to make sure, so one of the things we'd run into is you got dot body, and then you want to do ULLI, and that's an unordered list, and you want to style it differently than OLLI, right? That's just, you're not trying to be specific, but this has 3 levels of selection. So it just became really, really, really strong. Frick, what do we do with that? So flat selectors are magical. And long, nasty class names that you think should be really bad because our classes should be simple. But this right here, which is unordered, oh man, typing is hard. Ordered list in the body, which you'd laugh at that. That's actually going to be much more controllable, much more manageable, and you're going to get a much better experience. I'm not saying you should name it that, but that's actually better CSS than this, which is insane. So basically what we've found, and it's actually significantly faster too. This shouldn't be your concern. Don't make your decisions based on this, but it turns out that CSS selects backwards. So first it says, give me every single LI in the page, all of them. And then give me only the ones that happen to be within a UL. And then of those, give me only the ones that happen to be within .body. So it's actually faster to do this because it's like, hey, give me everything with that class. Oh, there's one of them. Great, we're done. It doesn't matter that much. Don't really worry about it. Don't make your decisions based on performance, but it is more performant. Okay, so flat selectors, even if they look like this, that looks insane, but that is actually significantly better than this, okay? Because you have this control. Now, every single style you're applying it once. It has one level of priority, one level of strength, whatever you want to call it. It has one specificity, and you can override it with an intentional other one. And so you can do things like, you know, that, and then you can say, okay, so it's unordered list in the body, and then it's also unordered list in the body reversed. And so those two classes have equal precedence. So you're purely in control based on either choosing to override those ones later or whatever else. You have all this control that you totally lose in these other contexts. All right, so that was a much longer rant than I expected. My apologies. So this is going to be a really funny slide because you guys are going to see that I was like, this is how to do BEM with Sass, and then you're going to be like, how do you do it in less? And then the next slide says BEM with less, and it's exactly the same thing. So they have the same syntax. They don't always, but in this particular context, it's the exact same thing. All right, back to our presentation. All right, but what about utility classes, you ask? So I work with a guy named Adam Wathen who he runs a podcast called Full Stack Radio. You guys should really check it out. He had David Hennemeyer Hansen, DHH on it, and they just kind of like cussed and talked bad about people for an entire hour in his last one. It was really good stuff. You should check it out whether or not you're a Ruby developer. But the first episode, he interviewed me, and we basically kind of sort of agreed and sort of fought about object-oriented CSS for the entire episode. So if you take a look at it, he makes the argument that utility classes are still valuable at times. And a utility class is a simple class like this where you just say, look, I don't care about making an entire freaking component and imagining what the name of this thing should be. I don't want to call it a module. I just want to throw a pull left on it from Bootstrap, if you're familiar, that just is going to pull it over to the left side and I want to be done. I just want it to be 6 of my 12 columns. I've already got a grid system in there. Why do I have to create a thing that says, well, why is it 6 of 12 columns? Well, it's kind of the body, but it's not entirely the body. It's kind of the article. And I just want to throw the column MD6 on it and then just be done with my day. I just want to make it small. I want them available. So I push back on him and I say, but the problem with that is your classes are now immediately tied to your presentation. So let's say this particular thing that's sprinkled all throughout your site is defined or is styled by being 6 columns, pulled left, small, right? You use it 20 times during your site. And then later the business comes back and they say, hey, designer guy, hey, developer lady, that's really cool. We want it to be 4 columns now. You now have to go 20 times through your whole site and you need to replace that whole list with column-MD-4, and you're going to find a replacer. You're going to be like, that one time it was 6, but I ended up replacing with this, and then you're going to miss half of them, and you're going to get fired. Not really, but you're immediately tying your markup to your display, and at that point, well, why don't you just do style immediately on the div? Now, that's hyperbole. But the whole point about CSS is you've got your markup, and then you got your CSS over here. It's like, hey, markup, you should look like this. And then later, you totally axe all that CSS, not really, and you pull another CSS and you're like, no, you should look like this. The markup doesn't care. The markup is just trying to represent content. So that was my argument. I still stand by it pretty strongly, but there's 2 ways to get around that. First one is, there's this article, I can't remember the name, but I think it's Bootstrap Without the Debt. We use this all the time. We want to spike a website out really, really quick. We want to use the advantages that Bootstrap give you, which is just easy columns, all that kind of stuff, but we don't want to maintain websites that are based on Bootstrap long term, okay? We want to do a quick prototype, we want it done in a couple hours, but we don't want to deliver something to the client 500 hours later that's actually still based on Bootstrap. What do? What we do is we come up with those names, so we do all that work of figuring out the names, but then we use Sass extend to just say that name represents pull left, column MD6, and small. So now, by doing this, I could keep it in Bootstrap forever if I wanted, but there's not a single Bootstrap class name in my markup anywhere. All I've identified is that this thing is a primary rail. And then later, if the primary rail becomes 4 columns, I go into this definition once, and I say column MD4, generate my Sass, and I'm done. So basically what extend does in Sass is it says this class extends these other classes. And so in terms of how we care about it, all it means is just take all the styles from those other classes and stick them in that one and then we're done. The way it works technically is it actually optimizes it. So there's other things in Sass called mixins and stuff like that, but the problem is if you have like a single mixin and you use it on 20 different Sass classes, that the code from that mixin that it's generating is going to be duplicated 20 times throughout your CSS. On a small site, not a big deal, but if you've got a massive site and you use some mixin that does, some, whatever it ends up being, and you do it 20 times, that's, that may be 500 more lines of code in your CSS just because you kind of use that mixin. If you use extend, it sets that line, that whatever the mixin was representing, pull left, for example. Let's say all it does is, float left, display block, overflow auto, right? It sets that once, and then every single time you extend, it just kind of adds that to the beginning. And again, this is kind of hard to just wave around. So let's just look at our Scratch thing right here. So if I do a mixin, and I don't remember exactly what the syntax is, but let's just say mixin, Ruby developers, don't judge me. And it says something like basically float left, overflow auto, right? So if I have two classes, and then .2, gosh, this thing's annoying. And then, my gosh, it's been so long since we use less a lot now instead of Sass, so I don't remember the syntaxes anymore. So if I do this, if I call this mixin twice, what I ended up generating, .1 and .2, sorry, is .1 and .2, and they're both going to have this pasted in, okay? So duplication, this is my final CSS. If I use extend, so let's instead create a parent class that says like pull left, oops, and then this one says @extend pull left. I didn't think I was going to be doing live coding, or I wouldn't be doing this in a markdown editor. It instead does this, .1, .2, float left, overflow auto. So now, instead of reproducing that same code 500 times throughout my whole site, it has 500 selectors that get applied to a single block of code. Extremely powerful. It's powerful for a lot of reasons, but the geekiest part of me just says, look at all that extra outputted code that I saved. That might save 1 millisecond and get me one repeat visit or whatever. Kind of
So
thing.
would you say with gzip that it still is
Yeah.
substantial? I mean, compressed, you're like
It doesn't,
4 or 5 characters.
I mean, if you're going to save delivery on anything, it's going to be your images. So like screw 5 lines of optimization in your CSS. It wouldn't matter even without gzip. It doesn't matter with gzip. It's
still a
pretty
priority,
minimal.
let's be honest.
But I care about it
Fine,
because I'm a
better.
geek. But yeah, like almost, and a lot of people I really appreciate who are like talking about these like crazy optimization solutions for CSS and JavaScript. They're like, you realize you could add like 2% extra of compression on one of your JPEGs, and it would equal like all the compression geekiness you could ever do on CSS JavaScript ever. So yeah, that's a fantastic point. Don't do things just because, and that's what I said earlier. Selector optimization, making your CSS a little bit smaller, unless it's the difference between pulling in the whole Bootstrap suite or none of it. That actually is going to make a couple hundred millisecond difference. But in general, this is more useful, more for mental use than anything else. So. And then later, so the reason this is Bootstrap with all the debt is because, first of all, there was the whole thing that I just said. Oh, sorry, I can't read. You guys can't see it so well. The thing that I just said where you don't have any Bootstrap classes in your code, but also you have a clean definition. You have your nice style file, style.scss or whatever, that shows you exactly which classes you're actually using for Bootstrap. So first of all, you could include only those, and you can get all the rest of them because you're only including the ones that are being extended here. But also you can just pull out and you're like, well, what does this really mean? Okay, and you can just replace the extend in primary Rail with your own CSS that does the same stuff, and then you can totally drop Bootstrap. That can be something you have a junior developer do 2 weeks later, and then Bootstrap's out of your project and you no longer have the additional dependency. But part 2, which I've been considering a lot since I talked with Adam first, like 2 months ago on the podcast, is you can build with utility classes and then extract components as necessary. And that's kind of his push, and I'm definitely hearing that, which is, he's like, look, sometimes you put a pull left on something or column MD6, you plan to keep Bootstrap around, and this just never is going to be a component. It just needs to be pulled left, and that's it. You don't have to make up some stupid component name just so that you can have an excuse of not having a presentational utility class in your CSS or in your HTML. You could just leave it and chill out. So the last 2 projects that I did, what I do often is I have an idea, and I'm like the entrepreneur type where I have an idea and I buy a domain name 5 minutes later and now I own like 500 domain names. But I'm also a developer. And I happen to develop with rapid application development frameworks, which basically means they get a lot of the repetitive cruft out of my way. So Bootstrap on the front end, jQuery as well. Come on in. And then I use an application framework called Laravel in the background. I also use Rails. And as such, I can develop an entire application in 2 or 3 hours just to see if it's going to work. I create a prototype of something in 2 or 3 hours, and then I decide whether or not it's actually going to be worth continuing for our company. And sometimes it's not, and I throw it away, and sometimes it is, and then I pass it on to my developers, and we do stuff with it. So I shouldn't be wasting my time naming components when I'm trying to build an entire application in 2 or 3 hours. So what I did in the last 2 of those is I use these classes inline, and then later, if we say, you know what, this thing is really kind of sussing out to be a primary rail and a secondary rail and a whatever, then we replace that, this call right here, this pull left column MD6 small with primary rail, and we extract it later. But the initial development phases, we might not actually know what this thing's going to end up being because we're still just kind of hacking it out as we go. And that's where I see the value of them. Is like, feel free to use them as long as you understand the technical debt that you're incurring. And that's true with anything that has technical debt. Feel free to use it as long as you understand the technical debt you're incurring. And for me, I was like, look, it's technical debt. Never, ever use it. And Adam's like, dude, chill out a little bit. I used it in my last 2 projects, and I got a lot done in a lot faster amount of time because I didn't spend all my time freaking out about what the name of the component was. So, caveat. So how to get started with object-oriented programming, or CSS. Flatten your selectors. Screw object-oriented CSS. Flatten your selectors and your life is going to be 100 times better if you do a lot of CSS. Organize your code. You can do his 5-class system. You can add my shame in the end, whatever you want to do. But organize your code. Start to get to a point where if you passed off your code to some other developer who'd never seen your project ever before and they had 5,000 lines of Sass, get to a point where they could at least begin to winnow down where it should be with some naming systems. And especially with Sass, you're not losing any performance at all by splitting up to 50 different pieces if you need. And if you guys don't know, if you import 50 different CSS files, that actually will significantly slow down your website. If you import 50 different JavaScript files, each of those HTTP connections will have a significant impact. Whereas if you take those 50 files and cram them into one, you're going to have much less issue there. In Sass, you can have 50 included Sass files that all get pulled into a single source Sass file and then spit out as one. No performance hit, but it's much easier to find where your files actually are. So start organizing your code, split it out. More files is not bad, more files is clearer. Make your classes do one thing well, which is kind of one of the things we focus on in object-oriented programming. So separation of concerns, single responsibility principle. Identify what this module should be doing and name it and say this is what it is and this is what it does and it's going to do it consistently. Independent of the context it's in, it's going to do this one thing. Decouple for usability when you see that this relies on this, 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 which means if you get somewhere else and it's kind of similar, you're going to try and pull it and use it there, and it's going to rely on all these other things that this other context might not have, and then you can't use it. So the more decoupled, the more encapsulated your thing is, the more you're going to be able to pick it up and use it in all sorts of other places. And finally, use a preprocessor because they bring a lot of the convenience of doing these kind of things into CSS. Preprocessors are great. I could give a whole hour-long talk on that. I was going to do an example, but I kind of think we're out of time. So I've been here for an hour already. So
it's kind of up to you. Do you want to run through maybe a short 10-minute one or something like that?
I mean, you know what? I've done some little examples that I didn't expect to do in line. So unless there's any particular things you guys would like to see, I think I'm actually pretty good. So I think. Thanks.